Well, for the second year in a row, the 49ers come in with the 4th spot in my rankings for this deep dive series, and hopefully this year they can get through the playoffs with a healthy quarterback on the roster. Today we're going to break down every aspect of this team, talk about if they have what it takes to get Kyle Shanahan his first ring in the NFL. But before we do get started, if you have just a second, please hit that like button down below. I really appreciate it. It really does help. I also just want to let you know, if you're new or if you didn't know this, I have a podcast. It's called the Fully Inflated Football Podcast. This series kind of overtakes the show over the summer, but with the season starting up here in a week, we're going to be getting into my weekly recaps and all that good stuff, so definitely check it out. There's a YouTube channel for the podcast, or just search Fully Inflated Football wherever you get your audio podcasts, and we'll see you guys over there. But without further ado, let's get into this 49ers team, as always, starting by taking a look at the team's offseason, and outside of bringing in Javon Hargrave, I'm not going to lie, this was a pretty rough offseason, and there's sure to be various criticisms of some of the front office moves that this team has made over the offseason and what has really turned into a rather reckless approach by Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch. Not to say that it can't work out for them. Obviously, I have them ranked 4th in my rankings, inside the top tier, by the way, for all the teams in the NFL, so I'm not trying to slam them, but it is an aggressive approach, and as we'll see as this video goes on, this is a roster built top down with some heavy star talent and not a ton of depth, and I think some rather reckless off seasons such as this one have put them in a very polarizing position. But let's get into it. We're going to look at every position group, where they got better, where they got worse, and if they stayed neutral. So with the coaching staff, this is going to be downgraded for now, which is not unfamiliar territory for Kyle Shanahan. He seems to lose a coach or two every year, but a big one this year. DeMeco Ryans, the defensive coordinator, gets that head coaching job in Houston, and this is now the 2nd defensive coordinator that Kyle Shanahan has lost, and this time they have to kind of go third party on the replacement with Steve Wilks, who I still think is a plus defensive mind, but DeMeco Ryans is special, so that's going to be one of the biggest kind of X factors for this team is how much does that loss of DeMeco Ryans mean for this team. I do think it's a downgrade, but hopefully Steve Wilks can weather the storm there a little bit. They also have a change with that kind of co-offensive coordinator, more of the passing game coordinator, if you will. Bobby Slowick also heads to Houston, and they bring in Clint Kubiak, who has a lot of familiarity with Kyle Shanahan via his dad. So definitely some mix-up with the coaching staff. But then in terms of roster talent, starting with the quarterback room, I do have this as slightly downgraded, and it's not something you're terribly worried about because Brock Purdy is the presumptive starter there, but he is coming off the injury, and you have less depth than they did last year. So not a big deal, but I do got to list this as slightly downgraded. Jimmy Garoppolo heading to the Raiders, and then, of course, they trade Trey Lance, and let's just talk about this now. Obviously, big recent news, and I think trading away Trey Lance for a 4th-round pick is just reckless behavior by Kyle Shanahan. And I can't even really blame John Lynch for all this. I think this is very Kyle Shanahan inspired. But this is obviously a quarterback that they spent 2 extra first-round picks to go and get with the number 3 pick in the draft. And they really never even gave him a chance. He's 23 years old. He started 3 games for this team. And I thought the whole point of going to get Trey Lance in the first place was the recognition that over time you ideally have a plus quarterback with great traits and someone that can transcend lesser surrounding casts. And obviously right now they have Deebo Samuel, they have George Kittle, they have Brandon Ayuk, they have Christian McCaffrey. And they feel like Brock Purdy can run this offense right now, and they can have the offense that Kyle Shanahan wants. But what happens in a couple years when 1 or 2 or all of those guys are not available for Brock Purdy? And I get Kyle Shanahan's offense is phenomenal, and we're going to rave about him in this video, but the Jimmies and the Joes still matter. And yeah, sure, Trey Lance might not be ready yet. You haven't given him a chance to play yet. He's 23 years old. He's incredibly raw. You knew that when you drafted him. But he still had 2 years left on his rookie contract. You got nothing in return for him. You got a 4th-round pick where last year you drafted a kicker in the 3rd round. The year before that, you drafted your current 4th-string running back in the 3rd round. They aren't exactly drafting great here, by the way. And I am as big of a Kyle Shanahan truther as you'll find out there. Viewers of this channel know that, but they are really playing with thin ice here with how they're constructing this roster. And I think the Trey Lance trade is the pinnacle of that, where I understand you have confidence in Shanahan and his scheme, but at some point you have to look at positional value and building the team through value and completing the depth and future-proofing your team. And I think they have done a horrible job of that here. So needless to say, I do not approve of them shipping off Trey Lance for a bag of peanuts. And I wish him luck in Dallas. But they do make some additions to the quarterback room. They bring in Sam Darnold, who Kyle Shanahan likes. We'll talk more about Darnold when we get to the roster breakdown. They also added another backup in Brandon Allen. So again, I list the quarterback room as slightly downgraded, not a full-on downgrade because ideally they still have their starter in place. Running back, really no change at all, so staying neutral. Christian McCaffrey got there like week 6 last year, so I'm not going to count that as even a mid-season addition. He was there for the most part last year. Tight end, going to leave this as neutral, though there is some shakeup here. They're saying goodbye to blocking specialist Tyler Kroft and then bringing in a new blocking specialist, Braden Willis, in the 7th round, who I had a very similar grade on as Cam Latu, another 3rd-round pick by this team that I heavily disagreed with. Did not see the talent there. He's actually on IR to start the season, but overall staying neutral with that tight end room. Very little change with the wide receiver room as well. Not really losing anybody, and then they add Ronnie Bell out of Michigan in the 7th round. On the offensive line, also considered downgraded here. They're losing their right tackle, Mike McGlinchey, going to open up some very major questions at that right tackle spot, as we'll see later. They also lose Daniel Brunskill, who started a lot of games for this team over the last few years. And they bring in depth in John Feliciano. So just to start there with the coaching and with the offense, already looking at downgrades and really no upgrades. But then you look at the defensive roster, and it's mostly more of the same outside of obviously the huge addition of Javon Hargrave, and this team is kind of going with that almost Rams style of stars over everything, if you will, and hoping that the stars can elevate kind of replacement level talent. And as we've seen with the Rams, that can get you a Super Bowl, or you lose a couple of those pieces and you're looking at, a top 5 pick in the draft. So that's really what it boils down to with this team starting to play with fire. Centered really around the Javon Hargrave addition that did not come cheap. He was one of the largest paid free agents in this free agent cycle, if not the largest. Obviously a great addition to an already amazing pass rush that I'm excited about. And it is going to leave that interior defensive line upgraded, as all they really lost was a rotational player in Hassan Ridgeway. So that's good, at least. That's really good. But the edge group is going to look at some downgrades as a result of not being able to pay everybody here. Samson Ebukam gets a big contract from the Colts. Charles Omenihu gets a big contract from the Chiefs. And those are good players. And, I think they have the pieces in place to be even better with the pass rush, but it's not a guarantee. That's a lot of pressures. That's a lot of snaps. That's a lot of sacks being lost there in those two players. Also, Jordan Willis played well for them in a rotational role. As far as the additions on the edge, they bring in Clelin Ferrell, former number 4 overall pick across the bay from the, at the time, Oakland Raiders, and Austin Bryant, also a former Clemson teammate of Ferrell. So the rotational depth is coming from Clemson, South Carolina. They also did spend a 5th-round pick on Robert Beal out of Georgia, but he is going to start the year on IR as well. So definite downgrades on the edge. As we mentioned, the losses of Ebukam and Omenihu are significant. And as we'll see later, they're going to be looking towards their second-round pick, Drake Jackson, to step up in a big way from last season's draft. And then the linebacker room, they do lose Azeez Al-Shaair, who got a nice-sized contract to show what he can do as a starter for the Titans. Not enough for me to leave that as a downgrade. They do draft D. Winters and Jalen Graham. They've got those two incredible starters, so it's not really going to impact them, I don't think. Going to leave it as neutral for the linebacker room. Then at cornerback, I do have this as slightly upgraded. It's nothing major, but they're going to say goodbye to Emmanuel Mosley, who's heading to Detroit. Good player, but he missed most of last season anyway. And then they bring in Isaiah Oliver to start in the slot for them, who I'm intrigued to see how he plays for them this year. But then the safety room, again, downgraded. They lose their star safety and Jimmy Ward. All they do to replace that is spend a third-round pick on Jair Brown out of Penn State, who's not slated to start, so downgraded in the safety room. And then kicker punter as well. Got to go downgraded here, even though they spent a third-round pick on Jake Moody. Already struggling in the preseason, by the way. Don't draft kickers this early. You just never know. But Robbie Gould no longer with the team. So probably one of the worst off seasons that we've seen throughout this series. Now, we'll see if Javon Hargrave can lift all this up, right? But you can tell they have some pretty major losses. And as we get into this roster, we'll see how top-heavy this roster is and why they're kind of building this thing on a dangerous house of cards, if you will. But before we do get into the roster, I want to talk more about this coaching staff, which obviously with Kyle Shanahan here, he's going to kind of give you that benefit of the doubt that this is all going to be okay. And I get that some people are just kind of tired of everybody like myself and so many out there raving about Kyle Shanahan, yet he hasn't won a ring yet, right? In Atlanta, the team falls apart in the Super Bowl. Sorry, Falcons fans, for bringing it up. But even here in San Francisco, it's just been a run of disappointments. And the reality is most of those disappointments can be pointed directly to quarterback injuries. And I can't really explain why that happens here in San Francisco, but obviously if you lose your quarterback, it's difficult to go on a Super Bowl run. Not everybody can draw a magic Nick Foles stretch like the Eagles did that one year. So in my mind, there's really no practical reason why Kyle Shanahan is like a choke artist of a coach or any of that, other than the results. I'm a process over results oriented thinker, and the process of Kyle Shanahan as a head coach is brilliant. He, to me, is far and away the best offensive guru in the NFL. He elevates his offense in a way that no coach in the NFL does, even more than guys like Mike McDaniel, Brian Daboll, and yes, Andy Reid. And it's not just his scheme, which has obviously been not just replicated throughout the league. That's like selling it short. I mean, his offense that he's kind of perfected in a way over the last 10 years has overtaken the NFL to the point that over half the teams in the league are running some variation of Kyle Shanahan's offense. And if you have not listened to Jordan Rodriguez's podcast with The Athletic called Playmakers, centered on Kyle Shanahan and all of his disciples, you're making a mistake. I mean, if you enjoy this series and you haven't listened to that podcast, I just can't do what that podcast does justice, talking about Kyle Shanahan as a coach, and just go listen to it. I'm just free advertising for The Athletic there. But it's not just his scheme that is really well documented at this point. It's just his natural talent as a play caller. He has such a feel for the game and such a, almost as you watch the Niners play, a tangible impact on the outcome of the game that you just don't quite feel with any other coach in the league. It really feels like he's almost in the huddle making the plays himself, with the way that he uses pre-snap motion to get different tells from the defense, and he'll just run a play as a setup play to see how the defense reacts, and then the next drive or 3 plays later within the same drive, whenever he feels it's right, he'll use that as a trap, and it'll scheme guys open in this brilliant way. And then you look at the way that he uses different personnel. He's got all these positionless players, obviously Christian McCaffrey gets brought in here, who's like the ultimate positionless player. Deebo Samuel, that's 2 two guys are both running backs and wide receivers. You got a guy in George Kittle. Juwan Jennings is like a quasi tight end wide receiver. Kyle Juszczyk they use in creative ways. It's so unbelievably fun to watch Kyle Shanahan pull the strings and orchestrate this offense. And it is frustrating for me to see so many people like push back on the idea that he's really, in my mind, the best head coach in the NFL, because he's had these quarterback injuries. He's able to do this with guys like Brock Purdy. And we talked about already his flaws as a kind of general manager of the team with John Lynch. There are certain criticisms to be had there. But if you're just focusing on his coaching impact, it's unparalleled. And I would say that really ahead of even someone like Andy Reid, who's amazing, but how much can you separate Andy Reid from Patrick Mahomes and Kelsey and Tyreek Hill and all those guys, right? So it's not a slight to Andy Reid. It's more of just a absolute glowing endorsement of Kyle Shanahan. He's really the number one reason that the Niners, despite some roster holes, are going to rank with the number 4 spot in my rankings. They are tier 1 across the board in terms of pass game coaching, run game coaching, where they stand alone, by the way, in run game coaching. And then even team culture, where that's kind of my benefit of the doubt slider for this series. A few teams have earned more benefit of the doubt than the Niners over the last few years. So a glowing endorsement for the offensive coaching. And then defensive coaching, this will be definitely interesting. You know, I have them in tier 2 for defensive coaching, which is still great. Top 13 for defensive coaching. They would be tier 1 if they still had D'Amico Ryans. You know, they've done some sensational stuff. I think they're right up there with teams like the Titans and the Patriots in terms of just how well coached they've been on that side of the ball. And obviously losing a brilliant guy like D'Amico Ryans hurts, but there's still a lot of existing coaches. The team culture is still in place. The leadership structure is still in place with the players and everything. You still have, by the way, Chris Kachurik, who's probably the most important position coach in the NFL, at least outside of offensive line coaches, which are incredibly important as well. But Chris Kachurik is like a huge asset that this team has that kind of flies under the radar. He's their defensive line coach. He's kind of said he has no interest in being a defensive coordinator. I think if he did, they would have promoted him already. He just wants to stay here, draw up his stunts, have fun in San Francisco, and be a brilliant kind of behind-the-scenes mastermind for this defense. So he's still here. That matters. And then Steve Wilks himself is a very good defensive coach. Him alone would be more of a tier 3 coach for me, but you put him in the existing structure of San Francisco, and the team at large, to me, is a tier 2 defensive coach team. And Wilks has been around, man, kind of started with Lovey way back in the 06 Bears. Would have been a part of that Super Bowl attending team, right? I was like 07, 08, I think, off the top of my head. But then after that, went the Ron Rivera route, was under Rivera for almost a decade in San Diego and in Carolina. Ended up not working as a head coach, but returned to Carolina last year, was promoted as the interim head coach, did an incredible job kind of rallying that Panthers team, and very few options out there for the Niners would have been better than Steve Wilks. So I'm excited for him, and because he is, you know, these older kind of retread defensive coaches, you know, they aren't always viewed as head coach candidates, and I think the Niners have a good chance of kind of stumbling into a long-term plus defensive coaching candidate here that they won't lose in the way that they have with the younger guys like Saleh and D'Amico Ryans. So kind of another sneaky, smart addition there for Kyle Shanahan. But as far as the scheme is concerned here, you know, Wilks has run really everything in the book under his tenure. Now, the scheme that the Niners have run recently under Saleh and D'Amico Ryans is actually pretty similar to Ron Rivera and like what we just talked about with Sean McDermott's scheme in Buffalo, where it is a very quarters-heavy kind of pattern-matching zone defense on the back end, and then with the Niners, it's been that extra sprinkling of the Chris Kachurik and Robert Saleh inspired stunts up front. And the Niners aren't going to get away from running all those games up front. That's been the identity of this defense and what's made them so special. And I think Steve Wilks is going to listen to Chris Kachurik and kind of let him handle the defensive front. And then Steve Wilks, who does have kind of that secondary background, he's going to be more responsible for the overall calls of the overall play, and then just kind of what coverages they're running and coaching up that back end. So I think it's going to be a really healthy relationship. I still expect this to be a super well-run defense, even though you're losing a guy like D'Amico. So overall, this is about as good as it gets in terms of coaching. In fact, I wouldn't take any coaching staff over what the Niners have right now. Just wish it didn't impact their front office in such a way, So it's difficult to, split those things apart. But in terms of how we do this series, we're just ranking how the coaches are on the field right here for this segment, and this is how I'd play that out. But before we get into the roster breakdown here, I got to tell you guys about the sponsor for today's video, Underdog Fantasy. The season is just around the corner, which means their pick'em contests are about to hit full force with the NFL regular season starting. I'm sure you guys have seen the screenshots of people sharing their underdog slips where you string together anywhere from 2 to 5 players where you're selecting player stats, anything from fantasy points, passing yards, rushing touchdowns, you name it. You pick higher or lower based on the numbers that Underdog sets. And you can win up to 20 times your money if you go 5 for 5 there. It's not just big payouts, though. This is the best way to increase your interest in any given, crappy Thursday night football game, or you want the full Sunday football slate. You can get that too. I'll be playing Underdog every single day that there is football going on this season. And right now, if you sign up at Underdog using promo code TFG, not only will you support my channel and this series, but they will match up to $100 on that first deposit. That is easily a full season's worth of extra pick'em lineups there. So that is promo code TFG at Underdog Fantasy, and good luck. Let's get back into it. But now let's get into the roster, which means we've got a very fascinating conversation ranking and discussing this quarterback room. And for now, it's Brock Purdy. Right? Stepped in as Mr. Irrelevant, probably the best Mr. Irrelevant ever already. So good for Brock Purdy there. And, this is a tough conversation for me because I believe in Brock Purdy. I was higher on him coming out in the draft. In fact, my analysis on Brock Purdy in that draft class before he was ever a 49er is some of my proudest work. I mean, I said, if he goes to a team like San Francisco, where he can show his Jimmy Garoppolo-esque traits with his pocket presence and his quick release and his point guard ability, I said he could have a lot of success. And he reminded me a lot of when Case Keenum went on that NFC Championship run with the Vikings a couple years ago. And we really saw that play out in year one for Brock Purdy. Now, I'm not saying he's limited to only be Case Keenum, but in terms of physical tools, it's very similar. He's not a strong-armed quarterback. He's right there in the bottom 3 of who has the weakest arms in the NFL. And in terms of physical limitations, that's really it. But that's a big physical limitation, right? That just reduces his margin for error. I think it does impact his ability to command the deep ball. And that's why when you talk about them trading away Trey Lance and reducing their overall ceiling at the position over time, you might have some concerns. And even if you start 3 years down the road getting into is he worth some mega contract or anything like that, fortunately we're so far removed from that becoming a conversation that we don't have to worry about that for now. But it is a difficult conversation because we've seen so many quarterbacks like Brock Purdy come through this offense and really have success. And it's not just Jimmy Garoppolo. It's, the CJ Beathard's and Nick Mullins of the world that have still had productive offenses in Kyle Shanahan's system. And Kyle Shanahan's system hasn't had nearly the weaponry that they had in that Brock Purdy run last year that really did a lot of the heavy lifting for Purdy. Now, that's not to say that he's just some true backup like a Nick Mullins or those guys we mentioned. He does have a lot to like, and I think coming out of Iowa State, the number one thing that stood out to you is he is a very poised pocket passer. He has the confidence you look for from a franchise quarterback, and he showed it right away as a rookie, and that's extremely valuable, and it gives him a chance to really prove out over time that he is a legitimate starting quarterback. He has that it factor to sense and navigate pressure while keeping his eyes downfield. He scrambles to throw and has pretty good technique to throw on the run with pretty good precision, and he's got those instincts to see those passing windows that so few quarterbacks can see opening up in play extension. So that's kind of something that he adds to the table that even beyond what like Jimmy Garoppolo had. I think Jimmy's a little bit underrated in that aspect, but Purdy's just a little bit springier in terms of his athleticism to get out of the pocket and do some of that stuff. So if he can continue to bring that to the table, and I expect that he will, and if he can stay healthy and then just get your typical continued growth as a processor and a decision maker, I would say Brock Purdy's at a pretty good spot there for a young quarterback, right? He started 4 years at Iowa State. His processing and decision making was not a question mark coming out of Iowa State. It's much more arm talent and accuracy that are going to be the question marks on Purdy. He's not perfect. He misses reads. He makes, questionable decisions, just as every rookie quarterback does. I'm not necessarily worried about that, but I do think if he's going to become a franchise quarterback for the Niners, you're going to want to see him over the next couple of years become like a top 5-ish processor and decision maker to compensate for what I think will always be a lack of real arm talent and real ability to utilize the deep passing game. So I feel like we have a pretty good beat on Brock Purdy. It's just a matter of that career trajectory and development. I really hope we see it. I'm a big fan of Brock Purdy. I think he's a ton of fun. But there's obvious question marks and limitations there. He went in the 7th round for some bit of a reason, although I thought that was too late. I thought he was much closer to some of these mid-round picks this year, guys like DTR and Aiden O'Connell. I think Purdy was a much better prospect than those guys even. So there's your Brock Purdy breakdown. Now, I will say Sam Darnold here really fascinates me, and I've been sucked back into Sam Darnold about 3 times throughout his career. I was a huge fan of him coming out. Really, really liked his game, and I think the Jets kind of spoiled him. Not like in a spoiled brat kind of way, like they spoiled eggs type of situation with Sam Darnold. And I think he's just been trying to kind of get in a rhythm, get his confidence back ever since then. Goes to Carolina, slew of injuries. They never really fully believed in him. They never bought into him as the starter. It is tough to kind of play with consistency when you're not in there every week with the team having your back and, repping with the ones. It's just been a rough go for Sam Darnold for the last couple years, but what a perfect landing spot to come to San Francisco, where every quarterback that's played other than Trey Lance has had success. But I do think there are a lot of traits there with Darnold that Shanahan will like. I think he's got a quick release. I think he's okay at making quick decisions. It's more of the long decisions that worry me with Sam Darnold, the long developing plays, the play extension when he makes those boneheaded reads. But I think in quick game, and especially here with like the kind of point guard stuff, just, get the screen out quickly, the ability to throw off platform, to throw from moving pockets, all of the stuff that Brock Purdy has found so much success in. I think Sam Darnold can really handle that stuff. And Darnold is a little bit more athletic than Brock Purdy. We actually saw him be very effective in the QB design run game for Carolina late last season, kind of unlocked an aspect of his game that nobody has yet. So I'd be curious if some of the stuff Shanahan had in the back of his mind for a guy like Trey Lance might come into effect if Sam Darnold plays. But also just his arm is just so much better pushing the deep ball. And even in the last 4 games last year for Carolina, he kind of sucked you back in with some throws that were like, oh man, the talent is just so real with Sam Darnold. Not to mention he gets to come home to California, gets out of the East Coast where he's been. There's a lot of reasons to believe that you could have kind of another former Jets quarterback go into the NFC West on his like 3rd or 4th team and kind of having a late career breakout. obviously referring to Geno Smith. I'm intrigued. I don't know if we see it. Ideally, Brock Purdy stays healthy and plays well, and they don't go to Sam Darnold, but I don't think the leash is like ridiculously long with Brock Purdy. If this team's struggling a little bit and he's starting to look a little bit more like a backup type that should have gone in the late rounds of the draft, you've got a former number 2 overall pick there, not named Trey Lance, who was the 3rd pick, but same concept. You still have a kind of, in a way, a developing talented guy to kind of see what he has. So I do like the pickup. I am intrigued. That's a lot of time to spend on a backup quarterback, but my gut tells me we see Sam Darnold this year. I don't know. We'll just have to wait and see. Brandon Allen, not much to really add there. He's a QB3 type, but yeah, it's going to be fascinating, to say the least, to see how this QB room plays out. They do rank 27th for me heading into the year. Obvious potential to exceed that, but I do think Purdy still has a lot to prove. It was a small sample size that we got to see last year. But no questions as you get to the weaponry. I mean, this group is absurd. I rank them 2nd in the NFL, and there's no team with the variety of assets and different types of players and just overall talent. We rank the Dolphins first because the 2 players they have are just so transcendently special. But nobody's got 4 guys like Brock Purdy and Kyle Shanahan have to play with here. So they do a lot of the heavy lifting here, especially because these guys are all, at their core, rack specialists. And I'm going to kind of just talk about these 4 players. Obviously, Debo, Ayuk, Kittle, McCaffrey. I'm going to kind of just talk about them all together, honestly, because the way Shanahan runs this offense is he just kind of finds creative ways to get the ball in these guys' hands and throw them at you in different ways. But you got Debo, who's one of the more unique wide receivers in the NFL. I mean, most of his dirty work is done on bubble screens, benders, drags, just like really simple ways to get him touches and get him the ball in stride, where, man, is there a better player in the NFL at just simply breaking a tackle? Like the contact balance and ability to shrug a guy off. Debo very well might have the crown up there with the best running backs in the NFL. So Shanahan recognizes that and makes that a focal point of the offense. He can run routes. He can catch a dig. That's where he's failed to kind of take that next leap into the elite wide receiver tier. Is he's not a sensational route runner. He does have drops. His contested catch ability can be hit or miss. But in terms of just who he is as a weapon, it's up there for one of the best offensive weapons in the NFL. And he's running back depth for them too. And they'll give him like 50 plus carries just as a runner, whether that's on jet sweeps or, lining him up in the backfield or motioning him into the backfield. He's a special piece. And then you got Ayuk as your kind of number 4 here, really. There's weeks where they kind of don't really need Brandon Ayuk because he's more of their downfield separator. And, if things are working on early downs and they can do their first and second down kind of design passing game stuff, and they're just kind of leaning on run after catch, they're going to feed Debo and Kittle and McCaffrey much more. Not that they won't get Ayuk involved in that stuff, but relative to these guys, he's a little bit more of an afterthought. So he's much more week to week in terms of production. But if they're facing tougher defenses that are better tackling teams, that are better at getting this team into those difficult third downs and more of the drop back passing game, Ayuk might be their best down the field receiver. I mean, his route running, his release, his ability to be that option down the field is incredibly valuable to this team, to have a guy that can also do those things, because I'm not going to say those are weaknesses for Debo and Kittle and McCaffrey, but I don't think any of those guys are as good at that part of the receiver position as Ayuk. And I will say, I think there's a pretty good chance he's going to leave after this year because he's kind of the 4th guy. I think Ayuk knows if he just kind of went to Kansas City or wherever and could actually be used in a traditional drop back passing game, he is a guy that could blow up and be a superstar wide receiver and get a ridiculous sum of money. It will be an interesting situation to play out. He's heading into the 4th year of his rookie deal. They do have him on the 5th-year option next year, but it really wouldn't surprise me if Ayuk is ready for larger horizons in the future. I just wanted to point that out, but we're obviously pretty far away from that at this point, and it goes to show you just how lucky they are to still have him here as this part of the offense. Then you got Kittle. He's your tight end, obviously. He's amazing as a blocker. Still arguably the best blocking tight end in the league, but he's probably the second best receiving tight end in the NFL. Big, long, incredibly athletic, easily the best run after catch tight end in the NFL. He's just relentless after the catch. He's never seen a safety or a corner that he's liked and doesn't want to bury into the ground on a truck or a stiff arm. I do think that's led to him getting beat up and banged up. That paired with his physicality in the run game, sometimes you just can't take the Iowa Hawkeye out of a tight end, and that's just who he is, and Shanahan loves him for it. He's incredibly valuable for this offense when he's healthy, but that is kind of the one knock on him, has been availability over the years, but he was there for the home stretch last year, really had a good chemistry with Brock Purdy on those play extension situations. I think Shanahan kind of had his mind reopened up to George Kittle when they lost Jimmy Garoppolo. I'm not going to say he forgot about him or was getting lazy or anything like that, but I think he looked back at the playbook and was like, maybe we should use George Kittle a little bit more. And man, it was good for this offense. So yeah, I think Kittle has a huge year if he stays healthy. And then, you have by far the best receiving back in the NFL. I've really said this for years, but I think it really came to the forefront with how Kyle Shanahan was able to use him last year. I think Christian McCaffrey would make an argument for being the best true slot receiver in the NFL if he just made a full-on position change and said, I'm not a running back. Obviously, his dad was a receiver for the Broncos. He has those chops, and he's built more like a wide receiver than he is a running back at about 200 pounds. But his technique in his routes, his snap and wiggle to run a whip route or to beat a guy in a slant, he's got release, he's got great hands, he's got instincts in play extension just as you'd want from a slot wide receiver. It's a little different than the way we talk about even guys like Alvin Kamara or Austin Eckler, even like Aaron Jones, where, they're amazing options out of the backfield, but if you put them at slot receiver, they're ultimately just another good slot wide receiver. No, Christian McCaffrey is truly up there with guys like Amon-Ra St. Brown in terms of just straight up a slot wide receiver. He is elite at that. And some of that stuff even translates to the outside. Like wherever they want to play him, he's great at it. And this really was a match made in heaven paired with Kyle Shanahan's genius. And I think even if, as we'll see in a minute, he's not the best running back in the NFL, he is the most valuable running back in the NFL because what he's great at, what he's elite at, is the passing game. So this is a really special quadruple set of weapons here. Now, as you would expect, there's not a whole lot else to talk about outside of those four. But, Juwan Jennings really is the perfect guy here because he's not a guy that's going to demand a big contract or be the first guy that gets written about by ESPN the next day, or even a guy that a lot of more casual fans are even going to know about. But they need a guy like Juwan Jennings to do a lot of the dirty work. He's a great blocker in the run game, but he's also just a really nice route runner. He's got size. He just kind of gets lost underneath as teams are worried about all these other weapons. Purdy can be like, oh, sweet, there's Juwan in the flat, wide open. Or on those corner routes where he's so efficient. And he has real traits. He's got good hands, body control, uses his size to his best advantage. He's also really good after the catch. But the thing is, he's just not fast. So, he's kind of their tight end 2 / backup slot / do-it-all offensive weapon number 5. Super underrated within the structure of this offense and makes perfect sense as their 5th. Then I guess we'll just, quickly go down the board. The wide receiver depth after that. You have Ray McLeod, who's a nice kind of gadget piece. They probably won't use him a ton as long as everybody's healthy, but a nice backup to have. They draft Ronnie Bell in the 7th round. A little bit more of a real receiver with some downfield ability. 7th round pick, you're not expecting much, but a decent enough pick in the 7th round. And then they do have Danny Gray. He's on IR currently. I don't think it's season ending or anything like that. He's the one guy that has like real field stretching vertical speed. When they drafted him, I think they were picturing play action shots with Trey Lance in his arm. Brock Purdy's not someone you want to design like 45-yard deep post shots with. So I think losing Trey Lance is a detractor for a guy like Danny Gray, but it's still nice to have that deep speed. And maybe if you get to Sam Darnold being in there, you can start to think about Danny Gray a little bit more if he can get healthy. Then you got your tight end depth. I'll list Kyle Juszczyk in there. Just they'll use him everywhere, and he does get some targets. They'll flex him out wide as a wide receiver. They'll throw him, screens underneath. They'll do a bunch of different stuff with him. He's a useful player. Nothing special, but worth noting. Then you got a couple kind of wing tight ends, Charlie Warner, Ross Dwelly. They like Warner more because of his blocking, and he's shown some nice flashes. Dwelly as well has shown some nice flashes in the receiving game when Kittle's been unavailable for them. It's a nice duo of backup tight ends. They also draft the pair of guys, Braden Willis and Cam Latu. Willis is kind of that sort of Josiah DeGuara, Tommy Tremble mold of your kind of girthy blocking hybrid tight end. Makes sense within this offense, but not so much in the receiving game. And then Cam Latu, I just never really understood this pick. Like, I don't think he's more talented than Charlie Warner or Ross Dwelly. They spent a 3rd round pick on him. He was the definition of a basic, non-standout tight end. I truly was one of the more questionable 3rd round picks, or just picks in the draft as a whole. I didn't see the need. I didn't see the value. He's already hurt. I hate to say it, but I really think this was a waste of a 3rd round pick by Kyle Shanahan. Don't see him really cracking the lineup at all, ever. As far as the other running backs are concerned, Elijah Mitchell is effective in the receiving game. They'll still use him, when they'll go to pony personnel sometimes with both him and Mitchell out there. McCaffrey can go play slot, and Mitchell is a good, receiving option in a more traditional sense for the running back position. The other guys, Jordan Mason and Ty Davis-Price, not so much, very unproven there. So a truly unique group of weapons. Again, they rank 2nd in the NFL, and obviously going to do a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of how good this offense can be, and ultimately why this team ranks 4th in my overall power rankings. But let's move on to our next segment here and talk about the run game a little bit more with these running backs and the QB run multiplier. So at running back, they rank 7th. I think Christian McCaffrey is a top 10 running back in the NFL, just like strictly talking about running ability. He's top 2 or 3 when you factor in the receiving ability. But just as a runner, he does trade the power that you might look for to be a more complete back to be so great in the receiving game. And that's a compromise they're willing to accept. And it's not that he's a bad runner again, right? He's got really good vision. He can hit that top speed and has good strength relative to his size to run through some arm tackles. He's really shifty. Honestly, it reminds me a lot of like Aaron Jones as a running back. And that's obviously going to contribute to a really good run game. They were one of the best running teams in the league last year and going to contribute to this 7th overall ranking. Now, they want to keep him healthy. He's a guy that's had injuries throughout his career, and they want him fresh for the receiving game as well. So ideally, they're going to be able to use Elijah Mitchell a lot. And it's a mutually beneficial relationship because Mitchell himself has really struggled to stay healthy. So almost like a 50-50 split here is in a way a best case scenario for both of these backs. Now, Mitchell has a little bit more play strength to him, a little bit more between the tackles power. He's been ultra effective when he's been able to play, but he is one of the more injury-prone running backs in the league. It's kind of a theme for 49ers running backs, going back to guys like Jeff Wilson and Raheem Mostert and Matt Breida. Mitchell's kind of in that same breath of really good wide zone runners that just can't stay healthy. Wish he could, because I do think he could be a starting, top 32 running back in the NFL. But maybe this is just kind of the perfect spot for him as someone that's more of a split backfield type of guy. And then they got Jordan Mason, who he's the guy with the power here. He's 225 pounds. He's been extremely effective in the small sample sizes he's had. He's a fascinating player. Beat out Ty Davis-Price, both rookies last year. Davis-Price was a third-round pick for some reason the year before, and Mason very quickly kind of beat him out. It's a small sample size, but he's looked really good, really powerful when he's played, and I do expect him to get in the mix, and maybe it's more of a 40-40-20 split in the run game, which is even more beneficial for everybody here. And then you have to list Deebo Samuel. I mean, he's going to get, especially later in the year and in games where they're in more of a pinch, they will put Deebo back there, and they'll give him tosses, run outside zone. He doesn't have your natural, vision and patience that you typically want in a starting running back, but it's not bad. But as we mentioned, he's arguably got the best contact balance and ability to break tackles. He's got great speed. He's a legitimate weapon as a running back, so you have to include him in the picture here, making it really one of the best quadruple sets of running backs in the league. And all these guys are going to play, and they hope they can use that rotation to help all these guys stay healthy. Deebo's had injury questions himself, so really nice group. Ty Davis-Price, God bless his soul, did make the roster here. That might be more of this front office saving face, because if they had to cut another third-round running back after botching Trey Sermon as a draft pick, I don't know if Niners fans would be too happy about that. But yeah, I thought he was overdrafted. Saw him as kind of a raw, former 5-star type of prospect out of LSU. Clearly hasn't earned the favor of this coaching staff all that much. There's still talent there. Not going to give up on him or anything, but there's not going to be a lot of opportunities for him here either. So again, they rank 7th in the NFL at running back. The QB run multiplier is not much. They can do some stuff with Purdy, but they really don't in terms of read options and that kind of stuff. But he is a really nice threat on play action keepers. Kind of gets that standard QB run multiplier that we've been giving these Shanahan scheme teams, because they do use the threat of those play action boots to make sure that backside end can't just crash down unblocked on wide zone, which has more value than it sounds. Now, again, like we said a little bit earlier, if they did go to Sam Darnold, I'd be fascinated if they get into some, QB power and read option stuff that he was really good at in Carolina last year. He's a big, fast dude, underratedly so. But let's wrap up the offense with who's blocking for these skill players and quarterbacks. And that's going to be where you definitely have your biggest question marks about this Niners offense. Now, we said the same thing last year, and they were still one of the best offenses in the NFL. And likewise with what we said about the Miami Dolphins, when they're running their schemed up offense with the quick hitting, it's everything. It's play action, it's RPOs, it's screens, all the, Brock Purdy's going to have a really low time to throw because of the way they run this offense. And that neutralizes what is ultimately my 31st ranked pass blocking in the NFL. But when this team gets into drop back passing game situations, they could run into some real serious trouble here. Now, they do rank much better in run blocking. They rank 11th there, but let's break it down. So a big reason that they are 11th in run blocking is Trent Williams is like the most unbelievable run blocking offensive lineman I've ever seen in my life. And I haven't gone back and watched Hall of Famers highlights or anything like that, but I imagine Trent Williams is right up there with the best run blocking offensive lineman of all time. It's virtually impossible to find not just a bad snap, but a snap where he's not winning the rep. He's got insane athleticism, even for a 35-year-old offensive lineman. His play strength is absurd. He has great technique to get leverage and land his hands inside, but he's also, has that dickhead mentality you look for. He wants to delete you and put you on the turf, whether you're a 280-pound defensive end or a safety, and you get him on the move. There's not a better lead blocker in the NFL. But even on top of that, he's got this unique trait where he kind of will even when he knows he's a little bit out of position, he'll just stick his hands inside and give you a legal tug just enough so that the back can get past his gap. So like even when he does put him in a position where he's not necessarily set up to win, which doesn't happen a ton, he's able to save the rep with at least a neutral outcome. He's remarkable. He gets a 100 grade from me as a run blocker. And even if you have questions across the board, that's a gap. That's a defensive player every single snap that you know is accounted for. And sometimes he'll handle multiple defensive players. If he's working on a double team, he'll help significantly on the front end and then climb to the second level. Or sometimes he'll pancake a linebacker and then go block a safety. Like, he is just absurd. And then, oh, by the way, he's continued to get better as a pass blocker. He's elite there too. Clearly the best offensive lineman in the NFL, and you could make an argument that he is the best player in the NFL right now. So he's insane. But the rest of this group is like the worst offensive line in the NFL. You got Aaron Banks at left guard. You know, Niners fans will defend him. He's a former second-round pick that I heavily disagreed with. And he's fine. Decent athlete, decent size, decent play strength, decent technique. Loses quite a bit in pass protection. His feet will betray him. His hands will betray him. He has been noticeably struggling to pick up stunts. I don't trust him in pass protection. And likewise, he's had a lot of mental lapses as a run blocker. Still a long way to grow in his development. Not like a complete liability, but, you know, as one of your best offensive linemen, you don't love that. Best case scenario, he'd be your weakest link out of 5. And outside of Jake Brendel at center, he's probably their best offensive lineman, not named Trent Williams. Brendel at center is very solid, and he's kind of an example of why when you look at guys like Spencer Beerford and Colton McKivitz, you will give Shanahan a little bit of benefit of the doubt, because when they lost Alex Mack last year, we looked at the center position, we were like, really? Jake Brendel's your starter? And, he played just fine. He was a league average center, really across the board, a good athlete for their blocking scheme. I'm not really worried about him. But then you get to the right side of the line, and I do have worries. You know, you have a year 2 4th-round pick, Spencer Beerford, and year 4 5th-round pick, Colton McKivitz, who really hasn't played much at all here. So entirely unproven at right guard and right tackle. You know, I like Spencer Beerford. He was a really plus athlete coming out of UTSA, ended up staying close to home as a highly recruited guy and looked really good at the Senior Bowl. I like his technique for Beerford. It's play strength. Got to get bigger in the weight room. Want to see those results this year. If he can add some play strength, I think he's going to be one of the better guards they've had in a while here, honestly. So I'm cautiously optimistic on him, but entirely unproven. Was very hit or miss when he played last year, which he did play a lot last year. Graded out very much as that kind of replacement level backup. You want to see more from him there. But again, they did survive him as a right guard for the majority of the season. And then Colton McKivitz, just entirely unproven. Clearly, they believe in him to replace Mike McGlinchey there. But the sample size is just so small to rank him too high coming into the year. But I'm fascinated. They've clearly seen a lot of him and are comfortable enough with him at right tackle. But how much of that is because they have to be, because they haven't had a lot of draft picks or free agent money sitting around to have a good right tackle. So while they've earned the benefit of the doubt, there's a world where this is a disaster. And when they get into third down, it's like tunnel screen to Debo or bust, because they just can't block anything from the right side of the line. And they don't have a ton in terms of backups either. They do have Jalen Moore, who is another mid-round draft pick from them in 2021, I think. Also unproven, has looked good as a run blocker when he's played, but obviously the pass protection with him not beating out Colton McKivitz, they probably are still a little bit worried about that. Not to say he can't get better. But then Matt Pryor, surprised he still has a job. He was honestly the number one cause of everything going to shit in Indianapolis last year. Now, there was a lot of problems, but Matt Pryor was the biggest of which. Some of the worst feet you'll ever see for an offensive lineman. Honestly, surprised that they see him as a scheme fit in the run game, because he's more of a head-up blocker. So that's an interesting addition right there. You do have John Feliciano as interior depth. Burford was a tackle, so if McKivitz really struggles, maybe that's an option to put in Feliciano, who I think would be just fine here as a low-end backup. And then maybe Burford's play strength isn't quite of a problem at tackle, so that's an option, I suppose. And then Nick Zakelj, a draft pick last year, who we haven't seen really anything from. So it's a concern. There's no way around it. And obviously, ranking 31st in pass blocking is going to be a detractor from the drop back passing game here until proven otherwise. Now, you do have to mention that this is the best group of run blocking skill players in the league. Juszczyk, I think, is the best blocking fullback on outside zone stuff. I would give that to Pat Ricard on between the tackles stuff. George Kittle, maybe the best run blocking tight end in the NFL. And Jawan Jennings will line up as kind of that flex slot wide receiver. He'll down block, and he's got really good play strength. It's rare to see a group of skill blockers that legitimately help the run blocking, but with just an average grade on their run blocking skill players, they actually rank 17th. Obviously, the gap between 11th and 17th isn't large, but it does go to show you that they really do help out where they rank in terms of run blocking. So that wraps up a dynamic, if not polarizing, offense. It's a little similar, unironically, to the Dolphins' offense that we talked about. Obviously, Mike McDaniel there, coming from the Niners, but when they're ahead of the chains and able to just kind of dictate the tone and do what they want to do and lean on run after catch and the schemed up offense, this is one of the most unstoppable offenses in the NFL. Now, if you're able to slow them down, if you can run and tackle, and that's easier than said than done against this team, but if you can force them into the drop back passing game, that's how you're going to beat the Niners. But they do come out as my 5th overall offense, 11th in the passing game, and 4th in the run game. When healthy, this is one of the best offenses in the league. But let's now talk about the defense, and at least with what it's been under DeMeco Ryans and with what I expect to still look like moving forward, this is probably the most fun defense to watch in the NFL. I think what the Patriots do with all their different hybrid players is fun too, but watching this defensive line especially go to work is like football porn. And, we talked about this scheme a little bit in the Jets deep dive, but the Niners are going to utilize stunts up front as well as anybody. And that's a lot of, alluding to Chris Kachurik as the D-line coach. Again, we fully anticipate that to look the same even with a change in defensive coordinator. And I'll shout out my boy Robert Mays at The Athletic for the same thing we said in the Jets deep dive. Trying to play against this Niners front is like running into a hurricane because they are going to slant, they're going to shift, they're going to loop, they're going to stunt, you name it. Wherever they're lined up pre-snap, they're probably not heading into that gap once the ball is snapped. And that requires a ton of explosive, powerful, bendy, versatile defensive linemen. And they have 4 of them, especially now after adding Javon Hargrave. And this is, in my opinion, the best pass rush in the NFL. Now, because of the way they construct this front, they do trade off a little bit of D-line run defense. They don't really have that true run defending defensive tackle on this team at all. But I do want to start with the edge group where you have Nick Bosa, defending defensive player of the year. As I've said, I put Bosa right in the conversation with the best pass rushing edge player in the NFL. And it's kind of like a small spectrum. You've got, on one hand, Micah Parsons, who's like the most freaky athletic guy with the most raw power in the league. You got, on the other side of the spectrum, you've got Myles Garrett, who's also incredibly athletic. Maybe not quite what Micah is, but pretty technically polished. And then you got Nick Bosa kind of in the middle of the triangle where it's like super athletic and the most technically proficient of the group. And those guys all combine whatever variation of those traits they have to be in that top tier for me. But Bosa is a great example of why power to me is the most important pass rushing trait, because if you can put the fear of God in the opposing offensive linemen, that if they don't get out of their stance and get ready for the bull rush, then you've got them already, especially when you're like Nick Bosa, and then you can just string off of that whatever you want. He can swim inside. He can swim over the top of you. He can spin inside. He can bend around the edge. He can long arm bull rush you and then take that second hand and plant it again and put you on your ass. So he sets the tone for this whole group. But opposite of him, they're really counting on Drake Jackson to fill in nicely here. And when they picked him in the second round a year ago, it was one of my favorite picks the Niners have made in a while. He just made a ton of sense here as a long-term replacement to Samson Ebukam that they probably knew because of the production that, I don't want to say that they've gifted to Samson Ebukam, but that this scheme has allowed Samson Ebukam to have. They knew he was probably going to exceed their pay range. So really good idea to kind of put Drake Jackson in place for a year. He can play a little bit, but really just get ready to overtake that role as the number 2 edge. And they don't need Drake Jackson to line up and beat guys one-on-one. They didn't need Samson Ebukam to do that. What they need Drake Jackson to do is package his traits with good size, good get off, and good tenacity to just fly off the ball, be a disruptor, but also show some of that bend and athleticism that he had in college to be able to capitalize off of being schemed open on stunts. They've got plenty of guys that can win one-on-one matchups. They don't need Drake Jackson to be anything special here. They just need him to play hard, fast, and smart, and I think he's more than capable of doing that. So yes, they lost to Ebukam. Yes, they lost to Menahue. I think Drake Jackson can totally fill in for a lot of those snaps. And let's be honest, Javon Hargrave is going to play a lot of those 3 technique snaps that Menahue played last year as well. And while we're going down that track, a big reason they don't need Drake Jackson to win a ton of one-on-ones is because they brought in Javon Hargrave, who is another guy that can do that. You already have Armstead that can do that at a decent rate. Nick Bosa is someone you don't want to leave one-on-one, but you have to sometimes against this front. But Javon Hargrave is straight up one of the best pass rushing defensive tackles in the NFL. He got that payday for a reason. He's consistently been that now for years. He's got the complete package. He's like teach tape for a pass rushing 3 technique. Perfect size at like 6'1", 305, not so small that he gets overpowered, but not, I would just say short enough that getting easy leverage is natural for him. He's got the right athleticism and quickness to get off the ball, get up and under your pads quickly, but the lateral quickness to win with a variety of pass rush moves. And then the technique is fantastic for him. So even at 30 years old, there's no signs of slowing down for him. And the thought of him going into what was already one of, if not the best pass rushes last year is truly terrifying. And I understand why they looked at him and said, God, if you have a truly, let's just say, unblockable one-on-one piece on the inside and a truly unblockable one-on-one edge guy, what are you supposed to do? And then you throw all the stunts and chaos that they throw on top of that, and Eric Armstead on top of that. And this has a chance to be really like an all-decade type of pass rush, which of course is going to elevate this into one of the best defenses in the league and potentially of the decade, because that pass rush is so important. And we really haven't even mentioned Eric Armstead yet. And, Armstead's kind of undergone a lot of growth and development and change throughout his career. He came into the league as this kind of raw hybrid end. They didn't necessarily fully know how to use him, but they knew he had potential. And he was pretty good for a few years, but he's reached a point where like his fit in this scheme is so perfect. Like, to begin with, by the way, this team prefers to pretty much be in a wide 9 front the entire time, which means you don't have a traditional nose tackle. As we'll see in a minute, they really trust these linebackers to fill gaps and compensate for a lack of size up front. And then by stunting and moving these guys around a lot, you're creating some space that a nose tackle typically would. So the way they scheme this thing up is really clever. But, Armstead has gone from being a bit of a hybrid end, almost more of in the early stages, in their mind, like a Michael Bennett, where he's going to play 5 tech on early downs, defend the run from the edge, and then slide inside. Not so much anymore. With the new kind of wide 9 idea that they run here, he's just going to play like 4-eye, 3 tech, and that works for him. Because if they ask him to play really in between the guards, he is 6'7" and doesn't have the true anchor of a defensive tackle. But within this scheme, they can really let him thrive, honestly, as a run defender. Because inside a single gap, against a guard, as an outside shade, he can be a really disruptive player. And just straight up, like one-on-one, he's effective. He's got great length and get off and better power than he might get credit for. He's got enough swims and different ways to get past you beyond the power. And he'll use his combination of length and quickness to kind of get off blocks in the run game too. So like, he's just all around an effective one-on-one player. And with Hargrave coming in, he's going to see even more one-on-one looks. But I think at their heart of hearts, what they value Armstead for the most is he is the literal best player for the stunts that they run here. So if you're going to run a cross stunt, you need one guy to be a disruptor who's going to line up against whoever's in front of them and then basically blow up the other guy next to them. So you're hoping that the guy you're lined up against is going to take you, and then you also are going to occupy, say in this case, the tackle for Nick Bosa, for example, to loop around you. So that, to me, I call that the disruptor or the occupy man. He's perfect for that. He's got the get off, but even if for some reason he doesn't get off the ball quickly, he can still use the crazy length and reach and play strength that he has to be a disruptor in that way. So in terms of his ability to open things up for, not just Nick Bosa to loop around unblocked, but for Drake Jackson to loop around unblocked, or hell, even if like Robert Beal can get healthy, who has like 4.49 speed, he's great for that. But he's also like a loopy, bendy interior rusher, right? He's played some edge. He's a great athlete. So you can take a guy like Nick Bosa or Drake Jackson, who are big, powerful edges with great get off and strength, to just fly in, basically throw himself into both the guard and the tackle's shoulder, and then Eric Armstead can be the looper. So it's just the way they've crafted this front. It's like I said, it's football porn. Everything is so complimentary. Now, the last note here, and I've alluded to this, is they trade the ability to be so dynamic for some run defense. The wide 9 front can be exposed against, certain gap runs. You're really opening up the front. And none of these guys are, Bose is a great run defender, but beyond that, none of these guys are great traditional run defenders. Armstead's pretty good, but he's not someone you want to slide in between a guard and a tackle and ask him to, maintain his lane. So it's a trade-off they're willing to live with, and they're able to live with that, by the way, because this linebacking group is absurd, which we haven't even talked about yet. But I do want to talk about the depth here first. There's not a ton. Clelin Ferrell increases the floor of this group in case Drake Jackson just sucks for some reason. Clelin Ferrell wouldn't be as exciting as Drake Jackson. And, he's a first-round bust, essentially, because the Raiders, for some reason, spent the 4th overall pick on him. He is a reminder that you do want athletic traits at the edge position. He just didn't really have them. But he's a technician. He's a physical player. He's fine as a backup edge. A decent enough signing. Kerry Hyder's a physical hybrid end. He's a guy that, he is more of that Michael Bennett, where he can defend the run well on the edge, but you stick him inside and not so much. Likewise, he can rush the passer from the inside, but not so much on the edge. But, he's a decent backup that can play a lot of different hats, play a lot of different roles, wear a lot of different hats for them. Austin Bryant, physically minded, bigger bodied edge here. And then Robert Beal, I already kind of alluded to him. Interesting, I think they like his traits out of Georgia. He ran super fast, but was super stiff, was not a good pass rusher at Georgia. So, a late round pick, whatever. He's on IR. We'll see if they get anything from him. But yeah, the depth is what is fine. It's adequate depth. The interior group is undersized and lacks play strength, but I do like Kevin Givens. He's like a really, really, really super ultra poor version of Javon Hargrave. But as a third D tackle, I'm okay with it. Javon Kinlaw has some athleticism. He can be a weapon on stunts and stuff for a lot of the reasons we described. Eric Armstead, he's got the length and get off, but that's really it. Just has not had a lick of development. If anything, he's gotten worse in his time in San Francisco. I really think he's just a bust. His inability to play the run is infuriating. I mean, it's very similar to like Jerry Tillery, where he just has no anchor at all. So he's a passing downs backup at best. And then I'm interested to see what they get in Kalia Davis, another kind of undersized guy. Again, they have their scheme. They do what they do for a reason, but it's kind of parallel to the pass blocking with the offensive line, where it's like the Niners do need to be in a very specific game script to be able to do what they want to do. Because if you're running the ball effectively on them, they don't have a guy that can step in and play nose tackle. They can't get into like a bear front really and play all that well in a different way. So teams are definitely going to like start games against the Niners trying to run the ball and not let this pass rush get after them. And I think some teams will occasionally have success at that. But a lot of times they won't, because the Niners have, by a clear margin, in my opinion, the best linebacking duo in the NFL. They rank first in both linebacker coverage and run defense. And a big part of that is I think Fred Warner, I'm sorry, Ravens fans, I think Fred Warner is in a tier of his own as the best linebacker in the NFL. And I like Roquan. Maybe he has an amazing year and can get up there with Fred, but Fred's just on a different level in terms of that down-to-down consistency. Talk about a teach tape at linebacker in both phases. Similar to what we said about Javon Hargrave, just as a baseline, the physical traits are like ideal for the modern game. He's got the length. He's 6'2", 230, just big enough that he can hold up against the run and stack and shed and get off blocks, but small enough where he can still move in space and cover. So the athletic tools are like the prototype for the modern NFL. And then he's got it up here, right? That's where it matters the most at the linebacker position. He sees the game so well. He understands his keys. He does his film study. He's there on time, consistently in the right gap. And to do that in this scheme where it's a wide 9 front, he's got to read out the run. Basically, they're asking these defensive linemen to just muddy things up and buy a little half a step of time for these linebackers to clean up. And no better guy to do that than Fred Warner. But all that is equally impressive in coverage for Fred Warner. It's a guy that played a lot of that kind of like star safety, weak side backer at BYU. He's got the coverage feel. He reads the quarterback's eyes, flows through play action, knows where the quarterback is trying to attack him. He doesn't bite on play action. That's maybe the best thing that Fred Warner has is doesn't take the cheese on play fakes. He's insane, man. If you want a criticism on him, it's that last year he did miss a few too many tackles for your liking. And he's about a 10% career missed tackle guy. So if you want to knock on Fred Warner, it's true tackling consistency isn't up there with the truly elite guys, but it's not like he's a bad tackler or anything. So I will die on the hill that Fred Warner is far and away the best linebacker in the NFL. And then Dre Greenlaw would be the best linebacker on 20 other teams in the NFL. I don't think that's crazy to say. I mean, he is just a Fred Warner with the dials turned down 10%, but you can really echo a lot of the stuff we said about Fred Warner with Dre Greenlaw. He's got perfect size. He himself is like 6'1", 230. So he can still take on blocks and play with physicality, but he's athletic in space and reads out, passing concepts extremely well. And, he got a big contract last year, had a career year. It was interesting because he arguably cost them the Bears game week 1. He had like 3 super costly plays, breakdowns in coverage and, just bad linebacker play. But after that, they paid him, and he resumed being really one of the 10 to 12 best linebackers in football. So very little else to say there in terms of depth. Oren Burks, athletic guy, has been around the league. Maybe better coaching here can get something out of him. Was a third-round pick with a lot of potential, and he's shown better film lately, so I'm intrigued at least. He should have an opportunity to step into the weak side backer role that Azeez Al-Shaair played last year. They also have a converted safety in Flanagan Fowles. Has made some plays. Still a lot to prove. Love the D Winters pick in the sixth round for them. I saw him definitely more as a late third, early fourth round caliber guy. Super athletic. His game against Michigan was the best game any individual linebacker had in this year's draft. It's just that was really all he. The rest of his tape kind of sucked. But his traits, he's got 4.5 speed. He's similar to Dre Greenlaw athletically speaking. So love him in a developmental spot here. Jalen Graham. He, on the other hand, similar to what Fred Warner played in college. Jalen Graham played a lot of that wing linebacker, almost a slot corner a lot of the time. So they're looking for a similar career growth trajectory to Fred Warner. So a couple of late round depth fillers that probably won't play this year, but wouldn't be surprised if a couple years from now, one of those two players, Winters or Graham, turned into nice linebackers. So, man, before we even talk about the secondary, this front six is I can't even come up with words to describe how perfect this front plays together, and it could be better than ever as long as that transition with Wilkes coming in is smooth. Now, this secondary, it's a pretty average group. They actually ranked 26th in the NFL. I don't think it's a bad group. I think it's plenty good enough. In fact, it might even be a little bit better than what they had last year. Though, losing Jimmy Ward does hurt. They're really counting on this front to reduce what they have to ask these guys to do. And that's honestly very fair of them to think that that's possible after what we just talked about. So these guys are going to have about as easy of a job as any secondary in the league. But before we even talk about what these guys do in coverage, I just want to say off the bat, these guys are dogs in run defense. They rank top 10 for me for that DB run support, and that's important as well. They really rely on the second level, as we've talked about, to fill their gaps, be a part of the run fits, tackle consistently, and they're going to live with being, non-elite in run defense as long as they don't give up big runs and can eventually force you into the passing game. Now, when they do get into the passing game, if you can block this front, again, extremely more easier said than done, you can pass on these guys. They do, however, have a number one corner in Charvarius Ward. Got a big contract last year, totally showed why he got that money. Some people called it an overpay at first. I said, absolutely not. This guy is a stud. Just you wait. Underrated player when he was in Kansas City. And man, he's that classic big physical press man corner. Good enough speed to hang deep. Yeah, he'll have his reps where he's a little bit stiffer or whatever. He's not Sauce Gardner or some close to lockdown corner, but definitely good enough to be a number one corner for this team. And any questions I have about this secondary don't lie with Charvarius Ward. They lie with the rest of these guys. Diamador Lenore is a polarizing number two corner, to say the least. Has had some hiccups in the NFL, has had some really ugly games, but in the last 5 games of last year, and they had to really ask a lot of him once Emmanuel Mosley went down last year, in the last 5 games of last year, he blew up and looked like a potential star. Coming out of college, he played that off-zone pattern-matching quarters coverage that they run a lot of here, and he was really instinctive coming out. And we started to see those instincts really break through last year, where he was jumping balls on the outside. He was playing with that, speed and confidence deep down the field. And clearly, they felt good enough about what they saw there last year to say, you are our Emmanuel Mosley replacement, who is a very similar skill set. So I'm very intrigued. I liked the pick. I liked the prospect. Seems to be, heading in the right direction, has the right head on his shoulders. And as the number 2 corner here in a scheme that works with a great pass rush in front of him, definitely has breakout potential. But you can't completely ignore the ugly games he had just last year either. So there's bust potential there too. And then Isaiah Oliver in the slot, kind of a sneaky good signing for this Niners team. 2 years, like $7 million, so like middle of the road starter money for a slot. And they clearly like him because of his consistency in run defense. He's a big-bodied guy. It's like 205, 210 pounds, 6'2". He's going to shed and come downfield and give them a little bit of what they were missing when they let Kwan Williams go. And he's going to kind of fill that C gap or D gap, whatever they're asking him to do, really well. A lot of times like a strong safety would. So, like, that's, I think, as a baseline, what they really like about him. But he's shown some really nice stuff in coverage over the last couple of years. He's had some injury woes. Makes sense why the Niners like him, but he does seem to have figured stuff out as a slot corner. He did not work out as an outside corner, whatever reason. Just his skill set hasn't worked out there. But with his length and relative quickness to his size and a skill set where he's turning into a smarter player, man, I'm really intrigued that he could be a big-time playmaker for them in the slot. If nothing else, I don't think he's going to be a true weakness for them. He will have his losses in coverage, and he's far from a given. But I like the signing, and I'm definitely interested as another kind of potential breakout there. And, man, if both those guys break out, good Lord, this defense is going to be legendary, honestly. And I don't go throwing that word around willy-nilly. Now, the safety group, in terms of coverage, really towards the bottom of the league in terms of coverage safeties. Tashawn Gibson's 32, 33 years old at this point. Now, what you love about him is he's super physical and has played over 10,000 snaps in the NFL. The only other guy I could think of in the league right now that has that many is Harrison Smith. He's incredibly heady. He's a playmaker when he can see it developing in front of him. But physically speaking, he's not the fastest safety around. If you end up with him matching in quarters or man-to-man, he's going to get beat in coverage. He just is. He's not a problem on the back end. He's not going to blow an assignment or lead to some big busted coverage or anything. But he can be had in coverage. And I would say likewise with Hufanga. He's a much different player, though. And Hufanga is the ultra-aggressive headhunting type of safety. Headhunting in the sense that he just wants to make plays. He's got what you might describe as a over-aggressive route squeeze where certain times you might be able to get a blown assignment out of him, where he might, collapse down on a hitch a little bit too quickly and abandon his quarters where, you might get that deep post to be completed over the top of him. You'll see some of those plays from him. And even certain snappy, shifty route runners might be able to get him on a head fake or a shoulder fake, you name it. So he's not a perfect coverage player, but man, the good plays he has are valuable. So it's always tough to put a true number on a player like that. He's almost like the Trayvon Diggs of safeties right now. But that's, it's valuable to have a playmaker on the back end like that, especially when you have a front in front of you that's not giving the quarterback and the receivers and the play caller a ton of time to think. So really fun player. It was great to see him break out. Loved the draft pick when they made it. And it's been good to see him have success. I don't really know where Niners fans are. I haven't seen a ton of crazy Talanoa Hufanga hype saying he's a top 10 safety or anything like that. I don't think he is. But anytime you have a guy with a lot of interceptions and big time plays in prime time, it can get a little bit overhyped. But I'm not saying that Niners fans are doing that. I'm just pointing out he's got some strengths, he's got some weaknesses. He's a fine player in the back end. And that rounds out your starters. They're not going to go to a lot of dime because why would you? You have the best linebacking duo in the NFL and the best front four in the NFL, at least in terms of pass rushing. But as far as the depth is concerned, you do have some interesting names. I'm not giving up on Ambry Thomas yet. I hyped him up in last year's deep dive, and Niners fans were like, no, he's not going to see the field. He's been terrible all camp. That was last year. And clearly, Niners fans, you were right. He had a flash-in-the-pan rookie year, but something's going on where he's struggling to carve out a starting role here. Still interested, though. Really good athlete. Liked the player coming out of Michigan. Still young, still has potential. Samuel Womack was in the mix for the starting slot job last year. Struggled to stay healthy, though, but flashed a lot of good plays. So if Isaiah Oliver struggles, you might have a decent floor there with a guy like Womack in year 2. And then Darrell Luter, loved this draft pick. This was like the one pick. I mean, I like D. Winters too, but Luter was the one pick where I was like, that guy might be a year 1 contributor for them. Smart, physical, all-around balanced corner coming out of Southern Alabama. Really fits the mold of what they're looking for in this secondary. And, you want to see him get off the pup, but I think he can play, man. Maybe never going to be a superstar, but if you get 4 weeks into the year and Lenore is struggling or Isaiah Oliver's struggling, I think Luter could play inside or out. And just definitely someone to keep an eye on if he can come off the pup and get into the mix. But it's a lot to ask of for a 5th-round rookie that has been dealing with some injuries. As far as the safety depth is concerned, I don't mind these two guys. George Odom has played a lot of games in the NFL. Excellent special teamer, by the way. Hasn't really ever had a starting opportunity as a safety, and I wouldn't expect him to beat out Gibson or Hufanga, but I think he has the tools to maybe become a solid starter for them, maybe a Gibson replacement or something like that. Probably, though, just, good quality depth, someone that if one of these safeties goes down, you feel pretty comfortable with him stepping in, though unproven as a full-time starter. And then they draft Jair Brown in the 3rd round. Jair Brown's kind of similar to Talanoa Hufanga, honestly. Ultra aggressive, has never seen a double move he doesn't like, extremely physical coming downfield. He kind of defies the laws of physics at times at Penn State when they would use him in the box. He showed better strength and shed strength and anticipation against the run than a lot of linebackers. So clearly they like him for that, but his coverage ability doesn't project very well to the next level. It wasn't great at Penn State. He was a playmaker and, caused some turnovers. Seriously, very similar prospect to Talanoa Hufanga. So it's not to say he couldn't work out here, but can't always catch lightning in a bottle. It's definitely a adequate secondary. I don't think it's really going to hold this group back too much, but it is just another aspect of this team that makes them slightly matchup dependent, because if you happen to have a great offensive line and you can slow down this pass rush, you can attack this secondary. But at the end of the day, I do rank the Niners as the number 1 defense in the NFL. 2nd in pass defense and still 6th in run defense. Yes, they have some deficiencies with the D-line, but with the way they scheme it up with their coaching, paired with the linebackers and a secondary that crashes downfield really well against the run, they're still a good run defense as they've been. They haven't had nose tackles in years past, and they've still been really good against the run. So it is such a masterfully crafted defense, and I'm just going to enjoy watching this unit while it's all intact, because they're that unique. Now, as we tie a ribbon on all of this, I do need to talk about the special teams briefly. They are going to have some kicker questions. Moving on from Robbie Gould, it's going to open up special teams questions for anybody. Not really worried about their kick coverage unit or the punting game or anything, but it's definitely going to leave them in that questionable tier for special teams until proven otherwise. With their strengths and weaknesses, we've hinted at this being a polarizing team and maybe a little bit somewhat matchup dependent. That's going to allude to them having a large list of strengths and a decent list of weaknesses as well. The strengths are overall offense. I mean, play calling, weaponry, run after catch, the run game, the Shanahanigans, if you will. This ranked as the 5th best offense for all those reasons. And then defensively, the combination of pass rush and linebacker, those two are like strengths plus, right? They ranked 1st in pass rush, 1st in overall linebacker play. elevates the whole defense to a dramatic degree. But they do have some weaknesses and question marks. Quarterback, I think it is fair to say it is a question mark. You've got Mr. Irrelevant in year 2 starting at quarterback. You feel pretty good about it, but he's got his limitations. The offensive line and the drop-back passing game, certainly, I would say more likely to be a true weakness. The secondary is just kind of at the end of the day. You're hoping the pass rush can protect them. But as we've said, if you can block them up front, you can get to this secondary. Special teams, as we just mentioned. And then overall, I think the fact that this is a top-heavy roster adds some extra risk. We've seen this with the Rams. If they can get through a season healthy and get lucky, they can win a Super Bowl. But the next year, if some of those injuries start to pile up and you lose 2 or 3 of those star players, you're left with a mediocre roster and are going to have a harder time winning games. So they're more like the Rams than ever, I think. But let's take a look at their schedule. What does this all mean? So Vegas has their over-under as high as anyone, 11.5 wins. Their Super Bowl odds are up there towards the favorites. They're heavy favorites to win this measly division where Seattle's really their only true threat. And I certainly wouldn't bet against them to win this division, especially because they're a team with how good they are at the line of scrimmage, and Seattle doesn't really have much of a pass rush to get through the Niners' offensive line. I would bet that they sweep the Seahawks because of that matchup, and they've had their number. I don't see that changing, and that's going to make it really hard on Seattle to win this division. So you're probably not betting on the Niners to win the division straight up at minus 245, but if you're parlaying, I think the Niners to win this division is pretty damn safe. Now, as far as the over-under is concerned, it's 11.5 wins, so they got to get to 12. To me, you could break down the schedule in depth. It's a pretty average schedule in terms of difficulty. They do have to play the AFC North, which is a difficult division, and they have to play the NFC East. So they're getting a couple extra difficult games that, maybe an NFC North or an NFC South team wouldn't have. But to me, it really just comes down to health for the Niners. I think if all their star players stay healthy, or if, maybe you lose one for a stretch of time, as long as they have a good run of health, I think they will win over 12 games, or at least over 11 games. But there is really some inherent risk there as well. So just kind of comes down to your degree of risk on health, honestly. And that all comes back to some of the criticisms about the front office and how they've built this thing. They have really gotten risky here in San Francisco. We'll just end this by saying that's a bold strategy, Cotton. We'll see how it plays out for him. But I hope you guys enjoyed this deep dive. We got 3 more to go, so make sure you subscribe so you don't miss them. Again, check out the Fully Inflated Football podcast. We're going to have episodes starting after week 1. Really hope you guys enjoyed. Please do hit that like button if you did. We'll see you in a couple days for the next deep dive. Peace out.